Today I want to talk to you about monster design for horror video games. Before I begin, this talk is going to feature images from horror games and discussion about topics that might be uncomfortable, so please feel free to leave, I won't be offended. Okay. Damn it. Okay, so monsters are present in a lot of different genres, but today I'm going to be discussing them specifically in the context of horror. As you might remember from earlier, I hate public speaking, but I love horror games, so it kind of matches up partially. So what I'm hoping to cover is the use of physiology in character design, animation and rigging, and AI systems and behaviors. I'm also going to introduce some relevant theories, specifically ones from evolutionary studies and psychology, that can give us an insight into the human condition. I'm going to do this because I believe that if we can gain an understanding into deep-rooted, ingrained and instinctual fears, we can design monsters that trigger these and therefore craft authentic horror gaming experiences for our players. So with fear in mind, let's see if this works. Yes, cool, okay. What is horror? Okay, so horror is a provocative form of dark entertainment that acts as a cautionary tale. It acts as an exploration into morality and immorality, and it often covers societal and cultural taboos. Horror features across all storytelling telling mediums in some way or another. It's present in folklore, in fairy stories, it's in fiction like novels, short stories, poetry, cinema, theatre, television, and video games. So what do we expect from horror? We expect horror to make us feel something, predominantly emotions and responses such as dread, fear, and disgust. We expect provocative content, disturbing visuals, tension-building audio, and fear-inducing threats. There are different types of subgenres that come into horror as well, and so you can usually find something that if you like horror, that's kind of important, you'll find something that kind of works for you. With different subgenres come different expectations though. So psychological thrillers present a puzzle to be unpicked and are often more concerned with stories about the supernatural or human killers. Whereas alternatively, a slasher horror more often involves an awful lot of gore, and it requires the protagonist to outlive a maniacal and relentless murderer who's just looking to hack and slash. However, this talk is specifically about monsters, so let's bring it back to that. I am going to have a drink. Okay. So monsters are a driving force that pushes the player onwards into the dark recesses of whatever twisted game world that they find themselves within. They also offer differing forms of player interaction. So if we think about different combat design, for example, depending on what the player is expected to do when they are faced with the monster, differs. So in games like Soma and Alien Isolation, they're offered the chance to hide, but they can't defend themselves. Whereas in games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, they're offered ways in which they can fight back, different weapons and whatnot. I personally prefer to hide because whenever I come across a monster that I have to fight back, I go into this really kind of panicked mode, which doesn't really help, to be honest. They also changed the ending of the game. So like I suppose the monster in Layers of Fear, for example, there are going to be spoilers. I should say that now. Yeah, so the monster in Layers of Fear is the wife of the protagonist of the person you are playing. Now, depending on how you choose to interact with the wife whenever you come across her, depends on what the ending that your game is going to be. And that's kind of cool. And crafts like different kind of like gameplay experiences. They can also really set the tone. So like the human cannibals in Resident Evil, for example, reinforce the vulnerability that the player experiences. it also pushes forth the point that you can't trust anyone fully, and you can't assume that humans are going to hold the same morals as you in those type of situations. So how do we make the monster? I wanted to unpack this quote from Masahiro Ito, who designed the creatures in Silent Hill 2. Now, the things that I find particularly interesting about this is the fact of giving them a human aspect that the player would believe is human, and then undermining that aspect by giving them weird movement and improbable angles. So taking something that the player recognizes and kind of using that against them is quite an interesting idea, in my opinion. So if a horror game aims to provoke feelings such as dread, discomfort, and fear in a player, let's just consider for a moment what scares people and why. Let's think about how we can begin to understand why this particular approach that is used by lots of other different designers, and you'll see a bit later on that that's the case, and why that might freak people out. Okay, so it's important to consider the human condition. There are theories which unpack the reasons why humans have such strong responses and impulses. The two that I kind of want to look at the moment is body horror, where you use the body and you manipulate it in uncomfortable ways. It's violations of the body. Cosmic horror, which is a little bit more about that unsettling feeling in the fact that we are mortal, we can die, but the things that we face in horror games might not. So Soma, for example, is you can't kill the robots. They're not going to die. You just need to survive. And that can be quite uncomfortable. So the emphasis is on the self. The video game places the player into the role of active engagement. The game won't continue unless the player chooses to keep pressing play and to keep moving forwards. So we need to consider the player. The player needs to feel unsure and distrustful in their senses and their perception. You need to make them realize that they're not alone, that they're not safe, and whilst ensuring that they do not understand what it is that's hunting them. So make them ask, what are they looking at and how can they begin to deal with it? Now the thing that we kind of want to, sorry, time check, okay. That distracted me. Okay. So using the human body and behavior as a basis for your monster design can lure the player into a trap. So they recognize it on a primal base level, but then they see something that's abhorrent and repulsive on the same primal level. Humans need to rationalize things in order to think about how they are going to deal with it. If you can't allow them to rationalize what it is that they're seeing, it's going to make them feel more uncomfortable. So why would they feel such discomfort? There are evolutionary and psychology theories. Oh, God, I can't get to my notes. Okay. Yeah, so there are evolutionary and psychology theories that work towards explaining that. As I've kind of touched upon, mortality salience is an interesting one because that is the reminder that we are all going to die, but some monsters that we experience will not. Also, fear of the other, the evolutionary theory, which determines that we're going to grow nervous around something that we do not understand. And then the uncanny valley is another good one, where it's the idea that we come across something that we recognize as being similar to us, but something about it is not quite right, and that doesn't sit very nicely. Okay. There are a few techniques that are already used in the industry when approaching monster game design that causes the player to doubt their own understanding and perception. It's in the self-doubt that we can make the player feel vulnerable and under threat, and thus engaging in the primal instincts that we discussed earlier. These techniques are manipulating the perception, what resides in the imagination of your player. I've got a few quotes up here which come from different video game companies when they're talking about their horror games specifically. But the one that I'm quite interested in at the moment is Still Wakes the Deep, when they talked about the fact of they wanted the player to use their imagination in the experience, and they didn't want to show too much of the monster because they felt that the monster is more intimidating when it's still in the imagination until it's shown on stage, and then it kind of loses some of that magic. Not stage, film. Just talking about films. You also want to distort the known. So by manipulating limbs and creating disgusting bodies that are unbelievable and inconceivable, you want to make the player think, you could infect me. That's where you bring in the uncanny valley and mortality salience, otherness. Zombies are a good example of this, or they are for me anyway. I hate zombies. They make me very uncomfortable. And I think it's that fact of like the disease and the decay. They're also near the base of the uncanny valley, so we do kind of have these repulsive instincts towards them. And also cannibalism is gross. It's really gross. And the idea that something could make me indulge in that by biting me is just, no, that's icky. Also, you could crush me, you could destroy me. When we come across these monsters like the robots in Soma or in Bioshock, we come across these physically intimidating monsters. And then you can outrun me. If you have an enemy or a monster that moves extremely quickly and you cannot outrun it and so you have to hide, that's particularly intimidating. Okay. This is going quicker than I thought. I'm keeping an eye on the time. Okay. So finally, agent behavior. There are a lot of people in this room that could probably talk about this topic from a much more technical perspective than I can. I'm just getting into AI programming, but it is fascinating to me. It's the idea that when you're approaching the design of your monster AI, that you're relying on coding, navigational and behavioral parameters to imitate life. That's really challenging and it's really interesting. So the one that I like to look at is the alien isolation, and the fact that they use the combination of the director and the alien AI system. So essentially, the alien appears to learn as the game progresses. This is down to the director AI being aware of the player's actions and feeding more and more of this information into the alien AI, as the game progresses. However, although it seemed as though the alien was learning and adapting to the player, it wasn't. The alien AI never cheated. Now, you can find a much better explanation of this. I learned this from looking at Tommy Thompson's YouTube video. It's in the bibliography. I'd suggest looking at that for a better explanation. But yeah, there are many AI systems that we can choose to adopt. But how do we design AI agents that appear intelligent without being too intelligent? How do you kind of keep that life in them without it becoming too computational? There are different games that do it in like interesting ways as well. So while I've still got a little bit of time, The Forest does it in a really interesting way, and I've recently I spent a lot of time watching this video on YouTube where a player has modded it so that they can have their character hover in God mode and then just watch what the cannibals and the mutants do. It's about a 9-hour video. But it's really interesting and it's really good because you get to see how these different kind of tribes live within themselves, how they communicate with each other, how they mourn each other, how they comfort one another, and they do these really kind of human-like things that just makes it really kind of cool, but also unnerving because when you come across them, there is something so primal in the way that they screech and they move, and it's horrible. But yeah, so summarizing, I am going over. Tying this all together, you can't isolate one element from another. You need to find a way to integrate everything and have the different aspects communicating with one another. This is something that has come up when I've looked at post-mortems from different games such as Until Dawn, Fear, Still Wakes the Deep. They talk about how everyone worked together. When they were thinking about the animation, they were also talking to the people who were programming the AI because you need to have these things work in a cohesive way to make it seem like it's actually alive. And finally, You need to use your player's deep-rooted, evolutionary and instinctual fears against them to create something that's authentic, something that doesn't rely on jump scares, because jump scares, they do work, but they don't stay with the player beyond the experience. This is some interesting things you might want to look at. Yeah, thank you for listening.